Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And today we are we've been doing a lot of Nauticam content on the channel today, and we've spewed a lot of abbreviations out there into the ether. So we thought today we would go over what all of those abbreviations stand for, and what each one of them actually is and does.
It's
So
a
Alex,
test,
if you
isn't
would,
it? Because I always get confused. So I know
uh,
what they
so if
all
you
are,
would,
but I couldn't necessarily tell you what they all stand for. So
true.
yeah, you could
So
answer
if
them.
you would like to start, we're going to start with the macro options from
Okay.
Nauticam and their wet diopters.
Okay. Well, the first of those is the SMC, which was the first to be first of all their water contact lenses. I think that came into being, and the SMC stands for the Super Macro Converter. I think. If I've got that wrong, I'm sorry. I should. But the Super Macro Converter, which is available in two flavors. There's an SMC1, which is very powerful, and there's an SMC2, which is even more powerful. But just because we're talking super stuff, don't necessarily think more power is always more useful. For me, I have both of them, but I travel with the SMC1 always, and I travel with the SMC2 rarely, because I think the SMC1 is far more usable.
Yep.
So yeah, and then that brings us on to the CMCs. Which are you going to have a go at one of these, Matt?
I think they're compact macro converters
Yes.
because Nauticam initially made them for compact cameras, but they can be used with certain lenses on certain other size sensor cameras. Uh, the CMC1 is actually the stronger of the two, which is backwards from the SMCs, and the
That's
CMC2 is the weaker one. The CMC1 is equivalent in magnification to the SMC1, I believe, and the CMC2 is a little bit less. So different lenses for different choices.
and
But
because they're designed to work with those slightly wider lenses to begin with, they do kind of have a slightly different setup to the SMCs.
yeah,
So they're not interchangeable really. They're actually things that you might end up owning both of in a certain system. I find if you shoot a CMC on a long sort of more telephoto macro lens, you tend not to get very good edge performance with it. And if you but when you use it with the right lens, a wider lens, it gives excellent image quality. And in
yeah,
fact, one of the things that Nauticam did with these lenses, which is why they've become so popular, is they've got water correction in them. So if you shoot out of a flat port, you have a few very minor image quality issues related to that port with a macro lens. And what's good about the SMCs and the CMCs is they actually correct some of that, because
yep.
Nauticam in their optical design had a flat port in there, and we're able just to, oh well, the flat port's doing this, so we can get rid of that with our lens design.
That's a good point. Is if somebody out there is looking for diopters, you don't necessarily just want to pick any random diopter because they're not all created equal, and you want the ones that are corrected for water because
Mm-hmm.
they'll increase your image quality and get rid of some of those optical issues. So like my two favorites are the SMC1 when you need something stronger, and then the Kraken +6. I don't remember the name of it, but it does the same thing. They're both water corrected, which is really important when you're shooting with those lenses because there used to be some older ones that were pretty trash because they were just magnifiers that you tossed onto
It
the
was what
front.
we had
Oh,
at the time, though. Compared to having nothing, they were great. And then when better ones came along, we realized they were trash.
yeah,
But yeah, they're not all created equally, and I think that the best designs, and they certainly don't need to have Nauticam written on them. I know one of the reasons we wanted to do this episode was to sort of clarify some of the stuff we've been doing on Nauticam recently, but um, there's a lot of Nauticam stuff we wanted to cover because I've had the chance to shoot the FCP before most people, and it's a major new product, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing this video is relating to that FCP. But we're keen not to just be talking about Nauticam products. So to reach out, not that there's going to be many other manufacturers watching a Nauticam abbreviations video, but if you are, we're always really keen to try quality underwater products, and we really want to talk about them on the channel. So yeah, do get in touch with the two of us if you have got something that you think we should be featuring. Right, let's move that on then to out of the macro lenses into the wide angle lenses. Oh, have I missed
and
one?
No. But since you brought up the FCP, why don't we just skip a couple and we'll come back to the others and you can talk about the FCP and what that one stands for.
Okay, so Nauticam's wide angle ports all end in CP, which I think stands for conversion port, because they take a lens and convert it into an underwater lens, an underwater corrected lens, and they convert it usually from a kind of a standard field of view into a very wide field of view. And the FCP is the fisheye conversion port. So it takes a standard lens and converts it into a fisheye. And the attraction to underwater photographers is not only is that lens then underwater corrected with excellent image quality as a result, but if that standard lens is a zoom lens, you also have tremendous flexibility in terms of using that lens. So the FCP is the widest of Nauticam's lenses. It's the fisheye conversion port, and it converts a standard sort of 28mm lens into a full fisheye. And as you'll see if you watch some of the FCP videos, it does even more than that with different lenses, which is really interesting. But that's where it sits in the pantheon of Nauticam's optics, which then brings us on to the two types of lenses that begin with W, which are the WACP and the WWL. And since it was invented first, we'll start with the WWLs, which stands very simply for the wet wide lens, I think.
Yep.
And these are wet lenses, as in they are removable underwater. So the WWLs, the first W in those stands for wet, and that means they're removable underwater. And I think there are two flavors of WWL at the moment. I may be wrong about this. There's the WWL1, which is usually called the WWL1B, and the B just stands that, in fact, it's got a buoyancy collar attached to it. And then there's a WWL-C, and that's the compact version of the WWL, which is a little bit smaller and is unusually, it's designed to work with a slightly wider standard lens. So the WWL-1B is designed to work with a equivalent of a full frame 28mm, and the WWL-C is designed to work with the equivalent of a 24mm full frame lens. So a little bit wider lens to begin with. The WWL-C is also smaller and a slightly newer design. But I think they're both very similar optically in terms of performance. I've used both. I like using both. I only own the WWL-1B, but I have used both.
Yeah, they're fantastic little lenses, and they do give the same field of view, 130 degrees on the widest, whether you're using 28 or 24 for each lens respectively. So with that, let's move on to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I hadn't quite realized that, actually. I didn't know whether the WWL-C at 24 was wider than the WWL-1B at 28, but it's good to know they're both the same.
Oh, now I hope that that's true, and I didn't.
Okay, I didn't know the answer, so this is why I steered away from that area. So we'll find out in the comments, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's something that we really like on the channel is, the comments are a great place to discuss things, especially because then every subsequent person who comes and watches the video can benefit from the comment that you've added if you have got some insight into something we're discussing. Moving on to the WACP range. In this case, the lenses are still, or most of them are still aimed at that 130 degree at the widest field of view. However, the W doesn't anymore stand for wet. It stands for wide angle. So WA is wide angle conversion port. And these are ports, so they're not removable underwater. And they come in three flavors. The most well-known is the WACP1, which is a very high-quality wide-angle port. But there's also a WACP-C, which is a compact version. It's a smaller, lighter, cheaper, not quite as good optically version of it. And actually, that actually comes from the prototype, actually, of the WACP1. And when I was working with Nauticam in developing that lens, and after I field tested the WACP-C, my feedback to Nauticam is that it's good, but if we made it better, it would be easier for people to see the advantages of water contact. And that led it to become bigger and heavier and more expensive. And then once people have got used to the more expensive WACP1 and were convinced by the theory, people then saw the value in a slightly smaller, lighter version. And so the old prototype then got re-envisaged as the WACP-C. And then sitting above those two is a slightly different lens, which is the WACP-2, which is a really big, heavy, meaty, heavyweight lens. It's used more by videographers than stills photographers because it's really big. If you've got a great big video housing, it doesn't feel quite so large. And that lens is also a kind of 130 to 140 degree at its widest, but it has reduced fisheye distortion in it. But the penalty for that is a much bigger lens. I do like using that lens, but I can never justify buying one or certainly traveling with one. So I don't actually own one, but any chance I get to shoot one, I do really always jump at it.
One thing to keep in mind with the WACP-2 is you can shoot some of the quote unquote higher quality glass behind it, like those super wide zooms and things like that, because it'll work with a wider lens like the 14 mils. So if your holdup is that you don't want to shoot a kit lens like the 28 to 60 or something like that behind the WACP-1, you can shoot something like the 14 to 30 or the 14 primes behind the WACP-2, and in theory get even better image quality.
Yeah. I think people underestimate how good a lot of those zooms now are in the latest, certainly on the full frame mirrorless cameras. They're really great. The standard zooms. I'm not going to use the kit word, but they're really good. And then that finally brings us to the EMWL, which I don't think we've spoken about much on the channel, but I'm sure we will because it's a real favorite of mine. And I actually, until recently, although I was heavily involved in the development of it, never actually knew what the letters stood for. And the E is actually for extended, I think. I hope I got that right now. No, I said I knew what it was. It's extended EM macro wide lens. Is that right? Extended macro wide lens. Goodness me, I hope I've got that right. And this is the big long one. That's a 3-section modular lens that Nauticam make, and it's specifically aimed at wide angle macro shooting. And I have to say, I think the last sort of 6 months has seen a lot more people get it out there into the field, into destinations that are really suited to it. And I've seen a lot of people producing really great shots with it in recent times, which is really, really nice to do. It's a very specialist lens. It's an expensive lens as well, considering it only has one roll. Whereas I think that the price of an FCP, although it's expensive, you're going to use it on every dive. The price of the EMWL, I think, is much less easy to justify because you don't use it on every dive. You use it much more sparingly. But what it does, you can't do any other way. And that's where its excitement is. The EMWL is a complicated modular system. You have 3 sections to it. The first section takes the lens on your camera and corrects it for the rest of the system. Depending on which macro lens you're using. So you have a first unit that does that. The middle section is the relay that flips the image around the right way round because of the way relay lenses work. And the final section is interchangeable between 4 different optics that Nauticam make, all with different fields of view. So it's a complicated system, but it's all part of the EMWL family that create that system. But hopefully, we've not made it foggier. We've made it clearer with the SMCs, the CMCs, the WWLs, the WACPs, the FCPs, and the EMWL. It now makes a bit more sense to everyone. But I have to say, once you get used to them, they do. Obviously, the naming is logical, and that's where they come from. But I know it can be pretty impenetrable when you first start hearing about these things. And particularly as the way photographers talk about them, they love a bit of jargon to bandy about on the dive boat.
Yeah, so that seems like a good place to wrap up. I don't think we've forgotten any of them. And if we do, I'm sure somebody will remind us. So with that, we'll catch you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching.